Hello, David. How are you?
I'm doing fine. How are you?
I'm very, very well.
Good. So we originally had planned to do this interview at Mount Vernon, but for logistical reasons, it's easier to do it this way. So you're in Florida, and I am in my home in Bethesda, Maryland. So I just want to let everybody know that you are somebody that has been to Mount Vernon. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And I so enjoyed it. It is a trip that I hope every American would try to take. And I know some people could never afford it, but it is a wonderful, wonderful historical site. Seeing the home of George Washington, the working farm that he ran. We think of him as a military leader and as president of the first president of the United States, but he was also a working farmer. Um, Bigger farms than we're generally accustomed to even back then, but he was a working man. And it was a wonderful experience for me to see the beauty of that spot and to learn so much more about him.
Now, Justice Sotomayor, for everybody who is watching, became a justice, an associate justice of the Supreme Court in August of 2009. And she had previously been a circuit court judge, Second Circuit in New York, and in the Second District, and also a district court judge before that. And she's a native of Bronx. She is a summa cum laude graduate of Princeton University, winner of the Pine Prize, which is given to the most outstanding undergraduate, and a graduate of Yale Law School, where she was an editor of the Yale Law Journal. So that's a pretty impressive background. I wish I had a background quite as impressive as that. But when you were growing up, did you say that you wanted to be a lawyer? Was that clear from your early days that you wanted to be a lawyer?
Well, it was, but for reasons that weren't self evident. I grew up in a housing project in the South Bronx, and there were no lawyers or judges in the projects in which I lived. But when I was 7, I developed diabetes, and I understood back then, it's not so true now, but back then, if you had juvenile diabetes, which I did, you weren't permitted to become a law enforcement agent. And that's what I wanted to become, a detective, because of Nancy Drew. It was the first chapter books I began to read was at about 7.5 or 8 years old, and it was Nancy Drew. By the time I was 10, Perry Mason appeared on TV. And I know for those audience members who are closer in age to me and you, David, we all know who Perry Mason was. He was the first TV lawyer, um, and the first lawyer on which TV ran a weekly series. And from him, I learned of the work of lawyers. And I began to think about that as a potential alternative to being a detective, because Perry Mason spent the first half of his show investigating the crime his client was charged with, and the second half in court proving his client was innocent. And I thought, gee, that might marry the two skills that I really admire, that of playing sleuth to a mystery, and secondly, my penchant for liking to talk a lot.
So, for those who may not have watched Perry Mason, he had the advantage of always winning the case. He never lost.
Nope, he
And
lost once, believe it or not.
once,
Once. And
okay, he lost
where,
once,
mhm.
but he usually had the advantage of having the client or the person who was against him admitting in court that he or she was wrong. In other words, he had the ability to bring the person to the point where the person said, I'm guilty. I did it. I'm sorry. That was a wonderful skill. When later I went to law school, I realized it doesn't really work that way so much.
I have to tell you, I've been a judge since I was 38 years old. I'm now 66 and a half. And it's never happened to me, and I've never read a transcript in which I've ever seen it happen at a trial. But that might be a point, David, as to why civic education, which is our subject tonight,
Right.
is so important. Because so many people don't realize what the purpose of a court proceeding is. We're not there really to find out if someone committed a crime or not. We're there to determine whether, under the law, a prosecutor has proven that this particular defendant, beyond a reasonable doubt, has committed a particular crime. Those are two different purposes because one, the rule of law, requires proof of a certain kind that meets a certain burden under the law and that shows that the person is guilty of the crime that the law says is a crime, not that which we might feel is moral guilt. And those are two big differences between, let us say, moral guilt, have I done something wrong to you, and legal guilt, which is, have I done something that the law prescribes, that the law says I can't do to you?
Well, when you were growing up in the Bronx and in junior high school and high school, did you get very much civic education then? Did you feel that you learned a lot about the way our government works at that time?
Nothing. And I was an early product of the change in the country. When Sputnik was launched by Russia, the United States had an immediate visceral reaction that it was behind in technology and science from the Russians, and that we needed to catch up. And what started to happen after Sputnik in the 1960s is that the country became much more concerned with STEM education, as it should have been. It's an important issue that needed correcting in our country at the time. But one of the things that began to suffer was civic education. There's only a certain number of hours in a school day. And if you were going to load up more on STEM subjects, you had to reduce other subjects. And one of the casualties of that approach was civic education. And most schools began to forego civic education. And that, I think, was of great detriment to our country.
Now, when you became a member of the United States Supreme Court, Justice O'Connor, Sandra Day O'Connor, was already a member of the court, and you had a chance to get to know her. I'm just curious, did she talk about her interest in civic education? Because after she left the court, she really got much more involved in it. I wanted to hear from you. When did you get so interested in this as a justice of the court? Obviously, you have a lot of other things you're worried about, but as a justice on the court, did you focus on civic education as a result of your conversations with Sandra Day O'Connor?
When I joined the court, Sandra Day O'Connor had already taken senior status. She had stepped down from the court as an active member. As most people may know, she was the first female justice on the Supreme Court, and she was appointed in 1981. And it was a momentous time for me because I had just graduated from law school in 1979, 2 years earlier. And at the time, there were no women on the Supreme Court. There were no women on the highest court of my state, New York, the Court of Appeals. And women were still a fraction of the judges throughout the country. Tiny, tiny fraction. When Sandra was appointed, it was such a beacon of hope for me. An idea formed in my head that my future wasn't limited the way I thought at first it might be. That I had potential to achieve other things in life besides just being a working lawyer, which is not unimportant, but that I could aspire myself to do something like becoming a judge eventually. When I got to the court, Sandra had taken senior status, and she had decided that there were two things she wanted to commit her senior status to. One was educating the public about the dangers of electing judges. She really thought that judges participating in elections could become unseemly, that they might be tempted to make promises to voters that they should not keep as a judge, because judges were required to keep an open mind in all cases. But the second, and probably the more important object of her education of the public, was in civic education. She had seen civic education decline in schools. She had also seen that civics was being taught in a really boring way. It was like, what are the three branches of government? Who's the president? Who's the vice president? How many senators are there? How many people in the House of Representatives? It was filled with facts, but not with understanding about what our civic process was about. And Sandra believed, having watched the decline of civic discourse in our country, that that was directly tied to the time in which civic education had declined in the US. And she actually did a study and spoke about the fact that if you correlated the decline of civic education in the United States, that this went down, civic education tracked it. I mean, civil discourse and its diminution tracked it, almost on cue with one another. And so she became committed to starting an organization called iCivics.org, which is devoted to teaching kids about civics and education in a creative and innovative way. It's doing it through game playing. And that's how it started its work. And it's reached over 7.5 million students, and over 120,000 teachers are using iCivics to engage kids in learning about our Republican form of government and about their role in participating in that government. Her involvement in teaching students through game playing dovetailed with my own aim of devoting my time on the Supreme Court to educating students on the importance of civic participation. You can't participate in something you don't know about. And so I tell students all the time, it's your obligation to learn about your system of government. But more importantly, it's your obligation not to let things happen to you as an individual, to be a bystander in life, but to become an active participant in understanding how you can better your community. And that's what civic participation is about. And you don't have to be a politician, and you don't have to be involved in politics, but you do have to be involved in improving the world you're in. And so those two, my aim and Sandra Day O'Connor's aim, went hand in hand. And that's why when she stepped down from active life, I joined the iCivics board.
Okay, so you're a member of the board now, and let me ask you today, in civics education, is the biggest problem in your view getting money from governments to fund programs in school, or is it getting students interested in this subject? What would you say is the biggest challenge you have right now?
I don't think, obviously, all efforts require resources. And so the lack of resources that we put into civic education is a significant problem. Right now in America, we spend $50 per student on STEM education and only 5 cents on civic education. That disparity is way off given how important civic education is to making better students. And there's a tremendous amount of social science research that show that students who become involved in civic education and in civic participation overall become better students. But I think the very first problem, and I think the most significant, is that I don't believe that our population, neither our government nor our citizens, understand the importance of civic education. There's one telling story that happened at the beginning of the country, and it involved Dr. Benjamin Franklin, who was coming out of the Constitutional Convention. And at the time, a woman stopped him and said, "Dr. Franklin, do we have a republic or do we have a monarchy?" And he said, "Madam, a republic, if you can keep it." And what he meant by that is that our Republican form of government doesn't survive without its citizens participating in it. Ignorance of what our laws mean, ignorance of what our society needs in terms of functioning and being vibrant is our biggest problem right now. We have to educate students, but in some ways we have to educate ourselves as adults and as citizens. And I don't mean citizens with a capital C. Are you a citizen of the United States? But are you what I call a citizen with a small c? Are you a citizen of your community? Do you understand that to keep it healthy, to keep it flourishing, we have to work together? And that's what civic involvement means, is figuring out ways to work together to make a more perfect union.
It's interesting that one of the only times in the United States where one has to actually know something about civics is if you're a naturalized citizen candidate. So was your mother a naturalized citizen?
No, well, no, because she was born in Puerto Rico, and under a 1917 law called the Jones Act, Puerto Ricans are born U.S. citizens as soon as they move to the mainland. So when she came over in World War II, she was considered and is an American citizen.
Right. So for those who are born, let's say, somewhere else, if you want to be a U.S. citizen, after roughly 5 years of residency, you have to take a citizenship test. I think there's 100 questions. You're asked 100 potential questions. You're asked, I think, 10 of them or something like that. You have to get 6 correct. Amazingly, 91% of the people who take it pass. But when the same test was given to native-born Americans not long ago, as you know, 49 out of 50 states, a majority failed. So sad situation.
That's a very sad situation. And David, one of the games on iCivics is an immigration game, and it teaches you how to become a citizen. You said 5 years of residency, but there are other ways, and the game will educate people on how to do that and teach them about so many other things, including how to run for president, what your rights are as a member of our society in the United States. Do I have a right? The game is called. If anyone's interested in playing our games and learning more about our country, play iCivic. Go to icivics.org and play our games. I will say something that I challenge almost every audience I speak to go on the website and play one game. And if you get 100%, you can stop playing. If you don't, keep playing the games until you learn more.
Okay. Well, I don't know if I want to take up that challenge because I'm not sure how well I would do, but if I get 100%, I'll call you. Otherwise, I
All
won't
right.
mention. Okay. So let me ask you about what judges and justices do towards civic education, because in effect, for hundreds of years, judges have written opinions which explain why they made their decision. And I assume that's about, to some extent, civic education, explaining why you're coming up with the reasoning that you did to justify your decision. Is that how you look at that to some extent? Is it an education process, or it's slightly different than civic education?
It in There is a civic education component to judicial writing. We are explaining the reasons for why we're coming to our conclusions, and so that's always educational. And in particular, when you have a majority opinion and you have a dissenting opinion, you get to see two sides of the issue. And you get to see in writing how people can disagree about something, but still engage with each other's thinking. Um, and so that's an important educational process. But one of my colleagues, Justice Stephen Breyer, has written a book about making a democracy, in which he argues that our decision making is there to ensure that people continue to respect the judiciary, that our opinion writing is our way of explaining to the public why the law requires what it does, and to have the public accept our decisions as right. And so that is educational, but it serves another function. It serves the function of ensuring the legitimacy of the courts, that we are not a monarchy, that we are not making up rules, but that we are following the law as we, the justices, best understand it.
When our first president, George Washington, appointed the first Chief Justice, John Jay, I was surprised to read that he had so little to do in the first 2 years. He had no cases, that he was practicing law on the side and negotiating treaties on the side. Can you imagine how that possibly could get done today like that?
I don't think it would. But you do know, David, that he didn't want to become Chief Justice. He had to be talked into it. And if I understand the historical lore, he was placed in the position to get him out as competition for running for president in the future, which it didn't quite work long term. But the point is that, yes, at the beginning, at the very, very beginning, we were 13 colonies that had become 13 states. The amount of business for the court was very small. It was also difficult to do because you had to travel. To become a justice, you had to travel to the circuits, the different states by horseback. And so it was physically demanding as well. Over time, as the country grew, so did the legal problems. And with it, I think, so did the importance of the court.
So, as you were beginning your career and you graduated from Yale Law School, and then you became a prosecutor working for Robert Morgenthau at the beginning. How did that come about? Did you always want to be a prosecutor, or did you have a inspiration to just want to work for him?
Um, Perry Mason, going back to the TV show that was my motivation, my initial motivation for becoming a lawyer. In one episode, um, the long suffering prosecutor who always lost to Perry Mason, Berger, met Perry at a restaurant after Perry Mason had proven his client innocent again or not guilty. At any rate, Perry said to Berger, I know how hard you worked on this case. It must feel a little frustrating to have lost to me. And Berger responded and said, yes, I worked hard on the case, but as a prosecutor, I am always seeking justice. And justice means, for me, that the persons who are guilty are proven guilty, and the people who are not guilty are let free. And you proved that the defendant was not guilty, and so justice was done. And I remembered those words by him when I went through law school. I wasn't planning then to become a prosecutor. I was following the path of most of my law school friends who were thinking of joining a law firm after law school. But in my third year, on a chance meeting with the then legendary Robert Morgenthau at Yale Law School, he invited me to come interview with him, which I did. And the rest is history, because I became convinced that maybe my original thought of becoming a prosecutor wasn't a bad idea.
But you wrote in your book, which was a bestseller a few years ago, about your life story, that it was a little complicated for you because you were often prosecuting people who came from the same type of neighborhoods that you did, and you kind of knew the families in effect, and it was a little difficult to kind of prosecute those people. Is that a fair statement?
That is a fair statement. It was an emotionally difficult choice. Most of my friends who came from backgrounds like my own felt that people accused of crimes were often not treated fairly in the legal system. And so they thought that it might be inappropriate. They considered it inappropriate for me to think about becoming a prosecutor, that I should consider becoming a defense attorney. And I did think about their viewpoint, but I realized for myself that Paul Berger's statements, that what prosecutors do is seek justice, had to be my guiding light as a prosecutor. Those who were guilty should be prosecuted and treated fairly under the law and in accordance with the rules of law. And that those who were not guilty, that I had to work as hard to prove them not guilty. And so I was a prosecutor that had one of the highest records in my office for top count convictions, meaning the very top count, instead of plea bargaining it down, I would go to trial and prove those people guilty. But I also had a fairly high number of dismissal of cases where I thought that the proof was inadequate to prove the defendant guilty, but beyond a reasonable doubt. And I described some of those situations in my book. There is a misunderstanding about the role of lawyers in the judicial system. You're not favoring one side or another when you become a prosecutor or a defense attorney. Both prosecutors and defense attorneys are serving justice. We're both doing our job. The prosecutor represents the people of the state. The defense attorney represents the defendant. And each of us is ensuring that our legal system is properly working. And so we're really partners in a common pursuit. And too often people see us as enemies. And I think that's an attitude that should be changed by people.
Now, I practiced law for a few years in New York, and nobody ever called me up and said, you should be a judge someday. That never happened to me, and there's a good reason for that. I wasn't that good a lawyer. But when you practice law, eventually a number of people recommended you to be a judge. How does it occur that you get to be recommended for a judge? Who picks judges, federal judges? Is that picked by the senators? How did that come about?
Well, let me start. All federal judges are nominated by the President of the United States and confirmed by the Senate. When I say all federal judges, meaning district, circuit, and Supreme Court justices. We have magistrate judges and bankruptcy judges that are selected a different way. But in terms of what we call Article 3 of the Constitution, judges appointed under the Constitution, they're appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. Every president has a slightly different way of picking their judges. For the very longest time, the way that it happens, and particularly in my state and in others, was that the president for district court judges, the trial level judges, would take recommendations from the senators of his state. I say his state because the presidents back then were all men, as they are to the current time. But senators of each state, particularly if they were of the same party as the president, could nominate people for the president to consider. If the senators of a particular state were of the other party, then the president could or could not listen to their nomination. Out of courtesy, many people from other states who had different senators from a different party were still appointed. But in New York, there was an odd arrangement between the Republican and Democratic senators at the time I was nominated. Both Senator then D'Amato and Senator Moynihan had an agreement, which is if the president was a Republican, Senator D'Amato named or recommended 3 people, and Senator Moynihan won. And that became reversed if the president was a Democrat. Moynihan could nominate 3 people, and D'Amato won. I was one of Senator Moynihan's nominees under George Bush, the senior.
And so, as one of the nominees, I'm just curious, who actually interviews you? Do you get interviewed by the attorney general or the senator? Who actually?
Again, you do get initially interviewed by the senator, and each senator has his or her own method of selecting people. Some senators, like Senator Moynihan, had a committee of lawyers and academics and other people community leaders, who interviewed people who were seeking nomination and asked them questions and then made recommendations to him. And I believe he interviewed a number of the people that they recommended. And he, in turn, would decide who he would nominate to the president. Other senators have different ways of doing it and rely on certain individuals or rely on certain staff members. So every senator does it slightly differently. And I'm not familiar with all 50 senator practices
Right.
today, but a lot of senators have review committees of some sort or another. Once the senator recommends you to the president, every president has a different committee that decide who's going to review each nominee. And it's generally someone from the Department of Justice. It's generally one or more people from the White House counsel's office, or it could just be an advisor that the president trusts with respect to nominations. So again, every president selects his or her own method of selecting who they will nominate.
And how does the Court of Appeals work? Is that slightly different?
That is slightly different because, as a matter of course, historically, presidents will consider the views of senators, but only consider them, meaning their priority is different for Court of Appeals. There are many less Court of Appeal judges. There's only less than 200 or about 200 Court of Appeals judges, and there's about 700 or 800 district court judges. And so for the Court of Appeals, again, every president has a committee of some sort within the White House made up of people from different departments of White House counsel's office, Department of Justice, advisors of various kinds. And they get together and usually supply recommendations to the president.
And you were appointed by President Clinton?
By President Clinton to the Court of Appeals.
Yes. So is it unusual to have somebody who's a Republican president appoint you to one position and then a Democratic president appoint you to another position? Isn't that relatively unusual?
Very unusual. There's only a handful of people who have had that, of judges and justices who have had that happen in their careers.
So when you were appointed to the judgeship initially, the federal district court judgeship, I assume you told your mother about it, and I assume she said terrific things, but did you actually tell her how low the compensation is to be a judge?
Yes, and I'll tell you the story, David. Senator Moynihan gave me permission to tell my parents that he was going to send my name to the president. He asked me to wait before making a public announcement until he first announced it. But he gave me permission to tell my mother and my then stepfather. They came to my home. I was living then in Brooklyn, and I told them, Ma, Senator Moynihan is going to appoint me to the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. And she knew I was excited, and has been my mother's custom her entire life. Every time I get excited, she gets excited. She doesn't know what's happening, but she gets excited. And she didn't know what was happening then. And she said to me, that is wonderful. You're going to make a lot more money, aren't you? And I looked at her and I said, Mommy, no, I'm going to make less money. I'm going to take a pay cut. Judges don't make as much as practicing lawyers. And I won't get raises for a very long time. And in fact, I had to be on the court, David, for more than 15 years before I got my first raise. At any rate, she then looks at me and she says, okay, that's all right, but you're going to travel as much as you do now, right? My practice had consisted of international commercial litigation, and I had some very famous clients in Europe and around the world. And so I had traveled extensively in private practice. And my response to her was, well, Mommy, no. My office will be in downtown Manhattan in a courtroom. And I really won't travel from that courtroom. People come to me for me to hear their cases as a judge. So I can see her wheels turning in her head, and she looks at me and she says, okay, but you're going to meet and befriend as many interesting people as you do now, right? You know all these famous fashion designers, all of these people involved in wonderful industries around the world, and they'll become your friends too. And I looked at her and I said, no, Mommy, The people who come before me want me to be impartial, so I can't become friendly with them. And so, no, I won't have the same kinds of relationships I had before. She finally looked at me and said, after pondering this for a few seconds, "So why are you taking this job?" And interestingly enough, her husband, Omar, said, "Selena, you have to know that if Sonia's excited and she wants to do it, it's because it's something important to do and that she will help people doing it." And so my stepfather answered for me. And my mom looked at him and said, "You're right. I should know that." And so it's a perfect explanation of my mother being excited for me, but not always fully understanding why.
But by the time you were nominated to be on the Supreme Court, at that point, um, she recognized it was a great honor, I assume. And with the Supreme Court, everybody gets an interview with the President of the United States. And how do you prepare for an interview with the President of the United States for an associate justice position? Is that all night, stay up all night preparing, or what do you do?
Well, what I did was I called a bunch of friends who had been who I knew had been involved in other administrations to ask them the kinds of questions that were tended to be asked during this process. Now, this was a different president, and so it was President Obama, and this was his first nomination. So no one could tell me what questions his people were likely to ask. But I understood that there was a process and that there was a likelihood that some questions would be the same over different uh, presidential administrations. I then sent out an email to my family of law clerks, and I had over 70 of them at the time, and asked them to think of questions I might be asked and to think of issues that I should consider and to provide me with any reading materials that they thought might be helpful to prepare me. I called up some professor friends who were wonderful and asked them to just make a list for me of the issues that they thought were currently most important before the Supreme Court. I knew what I thought was important, but academics are studying it from a different angle. And so I thought, let me get the academics to tell me what they think is important. And so the preparation is the way it should be for any job you undertake. You should be looking at what others have, what talking to other people who have gone through the process, understanding what the job entails before you go in for an interview, and thinking about what your position is on issues that might arise.
Right. So, when you were interviewed by a man who had been the president of the Harvard Law Review, did you
Yes.
tell him why you decided not to go to Harvard Law School and why you went to Yale Law School?
He never asked, believe it or not.
Okay.
He never asked. He did say that the one thing about me that he almost held against me was that I was a Yankees fan.
Yes, he was a Chicago Cubs fan, I
Cubs
guess.
fan, exactly.
So there's a famous picture of you being sworn in. I think your mother is holding a Bible, family Bible, and she's there. So, what's it like to have your mother see you being sworn in on the Supreme Court?
There is nothing more amazing in one's life than to live further than your dreams. As I explained to you, when I was a child, I never dreamt of being a lawyer, never mind about being a Supreme Court justice. I didn't know what that was. And to achieve a point in my life where I had finally lived beyond my dreams and achieved something so extraordinary, and being given the gift of sharing that with the most important person in my life, my mother, it was such a deeply, deeply felt moment. Most of us don't have the privilege of having parents alive at the end of our careers or at points in our career where we achieve the most. And so I am eternally grateful that my mom was there.
So the salary you get as an associate justice of the Supreme Court is not all that much higher than the salary you got many years ago as a federal district judge. Why do you think it is that, to be honest, there's so little corruption in federal judiciary system when people are paid so little money? And why are so many people still interested in being judges? Is it because they really want to serve their country? I assume money is just not relevant in those instances.
Well, that's absolutely true. When you are asked to serve, there is a moral compulsion to serve your country. And to be a federal judge is service as a lawyer, the most service that you can do for your country. You ask a very important question, and I have many lectures in which I've talked about judicial ethics. In our country, we take for granted that we have the lowest amount of judicial corruption in the world. And why is that? We don't pay our judges enough. We pay our federal judges very little. We pay most of our state judges even less. Now, one could always point to a few corruption cases that have been prosecuted. But by and large, we are in the world the most respected judicial system. And I think that's because, as a nation, we insisted on that level of commitment to the rule of law. And I remember being in Botswana visiting a few years ago. And I remember asking one of its citizens why there was so little corruption in Botswana. And he said, because our first king of Botswana set an example in which he said that our government officials were there to serve the people, and that we as the people should expect no less. And we, the people in Botswana, expect our government to work for us, and we won't tolerate corruption. And I don't know that we've had, as Americans, have actually understood that that expectation is one that we have inculcated in our culture. It's taken over 230 years of our existence as a nation for us to say, if you become a judge, you have both an ethical, legal, and moral obligation to serve. And so, yes, despite the lack of money, we don't need it, because what we have is the pride of service.
So, Justice Sotomayor, we're almost out of time. I would just have two final questions for you. First is the question of relating to civic education. If people want to do more for civic education, what can they do? What can somebody do and says, yes, I understand your message, I'd like to do more? What can an average person do?
Well, first of all, educate yourself. Go to idecivics.org and learn the games so that you learn about civic participation. But secondly, in virtually all states today, there are campaigns going on in which aimed at increasing civic education in local schools. Florida, for a few years back in 2010, after an impassioned speech by Sandra Day O'Connor, started a civics education program that has been highly successful. You can't graduate from I think it's either middle school or high school in Florida, unless you can pass that immigration test, David. It's a simple measure, but a very important one in having institutionalized civics education in Florida. There are other states like Massachusetts and Illinois and the state of Washington and others, including New York and many others, that have campaigns going on to increase civic education in state school systems. Everybody across the United States should learn more about what those programs are in their individual states. There are also national programs occurring. iCivics is leading one called American Democracy, Educating for American Democracy. And it's a national program that is looking at establishing a national model of civic education. And there's a website for it, and I encourage people to look at it and think about the various programs that are being described there. There are so many different ways to participate. I tell people it's not just simply politics. There are ways of participating in your community that involve service in so many different ways. So you don't have to be an outgoing political figure. You just have to be a person who cares. And if you care and look online, you will find a whole host of different programs in which you can become and show you are a concerned participant.
The final question is, suppose somebody's watching you and says, I want to be Sonia Sotomayor when I grow up. I want to be a leader. I want to be a great justice. What are the one or two attributes that you would recommend to young women and to young men that they develop if they really want to become a leader as they get older?
Passion. You have to, that's the first quality. To become a leader, you have to show people that you care deeply about things. People only follow those who they think are passionate. And so you have to possess passion. And then second, commitment driven by dedication and hard work. You don't get anywhere unless you work hard. I tell kids all the time, think of every sports athlete that you admire. They didn't wake up when they were a child to be a star. They had to work at it. Every basketball star you know has been on the court for hours, days, months, and years practicing that throw shot. You have to work hard to achieve anything in this life. And so you have to have perseverance and dedication and a sense of commitment to working hard to doing things right.
Well, let me conclude by saying thank you for your time. And I just want to conclude, and for everything you're doing and for civics education and for what you're doing for the judiciary system and for being a great role model. I'll tell one final story about your role model to me in this sense. One time you and Skip Gates and I had dinner together. And when the bill came, I reached to get it, figuring, okay, I can certainly afford dinner for 3 people. And you said, no, you cannot let anybody pay for a dinner for you. So you had to pick up the check for the 3 of us because you were so concerned that somebody would think that a business person had bought a dinner for you and it was an inexpensive dinner. So I remember that dinner very well because it was the only time a justice of the Supreme Court actually treated me to a dinner. So thank you very much for doing that. And thank you for this conversation, and good luck to you.
Thank you, David.